Okay, so you got burned badly, so will you tell me a little bit about that whole thing and how it turned you into a basket case, as you say?
Well, for one thing, I think I was competitive in school because I started school when I was 5 so that we could go to school, your mother and I could go to school together.
Mm-hmm.
I probably wasn't ready
Mm-hmm.
to start then, academically, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't having any trouble that way.
Mm-hmm. But emotionally, you were still...
Emotionally, I probably should have stayed home with my mother for another year.
Mm-hmm.
But I started, and so it was always, a competition in my head
Mm-hmm.
to keep up,
Mm.
everything. I had to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got burned, I was really, really, and I don't think anybody else realized this. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
Mother did.
Mm-hmm.
How frightened I was
Mm-hmm.
of fire.
Mm-hmm.
I was afraid to go to bed at night,
Mm-hmm.
afraid that the house would burn down.
Mm.
And there were a few times that Mother actually let me sleep with her.
Mm-hmm.
But I still was afraid to go to bed at night.
Mm-hmm.
And I was scared to death to go outside and go any place if I saw thunderclouds in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Because the couple of summers after I was burned, we had some really bad electrical storms.
Mm-hmm.
And actually struck the granary one day and set some gunny sacks on fire inside the granary. It also started, well, and I don't think it was lightning that started that fire. I think it was man-made that started a fire in the sagebrush up above the house, and there was a dry grain field across the road from it, and that grain field could have come right down over the hill and burned us out, if it had gotten out of control.
Yeah.
And also, there was a couple of haystacks. Grandpa had one, and I think Uncle Joe had a haystack set on fire by lightning that one summer. And so I was really
Afraid of fire.
afraid of fire.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that I just had to grow out of, and I don't know exactly when I finally stopped being afraid of fire.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it has affected me when it comes to sleeping because I still don't sleep.
Mm.
So it was just,
Mm-hmm. Well,
one of
tell
those
me,
things.
I know, I've heard the story again, but tell me how it happened, what age you were, just tell me the story.
I was 6.
Mm-hmm.
Your mother was 7.
So you had only been in
This is-
school a year. This was your
Yeah,
second year of
This
school?
is second year. We were in second grade.
Or first grade?
Second grade.
Oh, second
because
grade.
we didn't go to kindergarten.
Oh, okay.
And we went to school in Kelly. There was the schoolhouse on Mormon Row, but there wasn't enough kids for 2 schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were taking the kids from Mormon Row and taking them up to Kelly.
Mm.
And so
The older kids or the younger kids or just half
Everybody.
the kids? Everybody.
everybody, because it was 1 through 8.
So who was going to the school on Mormon Row?
Well, the kids, they had a 1-room, 2-room schoolhouse on Mormon Row,
Uh-huh.
and Aunt Helen and Aunt Arva and a lot of those, well, in fact, Lanny started school on Mormon Row.
Uh-huh.
But then, I guess there must have been some of the older ones graduated, went on to high school, and there weren't enough kids,
Oh.
younger kids then,
Uh-huh.
to have 2 schools.
Mm-hmm.
So they combined them, and everybody went to Kelly.
Oh, okay.
So, Hannah Horthorn was driving a school bus, and all it was just a wagon,
Mm-hmm.
team of horses, and he would come down the row. He was Well, their place was out almost by the school and by the church. So it was probably a little more north than it was south. So he could come down there, and maybe, I don't remember if there was anybody north of us in school. It was pretty much Uncle Clifton's kids and us, and then we'd go up through the field and pick up Uncle Joe's kids and go on to Kelly. And so in the fall and in the spring, he'd just have the little flat-bedded wagon with the wheels on it and the horses. But in the wintertime, they'd put a canvas cover over it with a stove in it,
A wood stove?
a wood stove, so that we could stay warm. And it just had seats down each side of the wagon, and it had a double door on the front of it, and just I think it was a single door on the back. And we were just coming home one day, and of course, we would come down through the field where Dad would feed the cattle, you know. And Aunt Fay came as far as the Kelly post office with a new baby on the snowplane with the mailman. She'd gotten out of the hospital, and so she was coming home with the baby, with him. And we were just getting out of school when they were at the post office in Kelly. And so she decided that she'd just ride on home on this school bus. But the baby started crying and needed to be nursed. And so she decided to get on the snowplane and go on down to our house, which is the Grovon post office. They had to make another stop. So we had just let Uncle Joe's kids off, and we're coming down through our field above the house. And Hannes had picked up a small can of kerosene for their lamps at home. It didn't have a lid on it. He put it on the back seat, right at the back of the bus, or the wagon. And your mother was sitting on the floor of the wagon. The door was open, and she was sitting on the floor of the wagon. And Lanny and Marjorie were out standing on the runners, because they had the runners on the sleigh for winter. And Jack had a rope tied onto the sleigh, and he had his skis on. And he was being pulled along on his skis.
How fun.
Shirley and I were up on the seat by the stove. And the stove was on. And Hannes was just standing there at the half door, you know, driving the team. And we went over a bump. And when we did, the can of gas fell off the seat and came rolling down the aisle. And we didn't know what was going to happen. We're two little 7-year-old, 6-year-old.
But you were
kids.
watching it happen.
We saw it happen, but as soon as he saw it, he knew what was going to happen. He yelled, "Jump!" And out over the door he went.
Oh.
He didn't let go of the horses, and he ended up on the tongue of the wagon. But until that gas blew up,
Oh my gosh.
Shirley and I didn't know what to do. But he had yelled, "Jump!" And so we climbed up on that door, on that half door, and we're just hanging on either side
Wow.
with our hands. And of course, as soon as that thing blew, the team started running, you know. And he fell off Hannes fell off the tongue of the wagon, but he still had a hold of the team, had a hold of the reins, and he was being dragged along in the snow. Well, we knew we had to jump, but the team are running. I mean, you're tearing
you're
down
a little
this.
kid. Oh my gosh.
Shirley finally just fell, and she fell right down between the runners on the sleigh, and the sleigh ran over her.
Ugh.
And then I jumped out into the snow on the side.
Mm-hmm.
She got a little cut on her head,
Mm-hmm.
a little tiny cut, but it knocked her out.
Mm-hmm.
So she was just laying on the road, knocked out.
Mm-hmm.
I just jumped out in the snow. But that can of gas rolled back then and right over the top of your mother. And she was completely on fire.
Huh, I didn't even know that.
Lanny was 8 years old. He had the presence to grab her and roll her in the snow.
Mm-hmm.
But because we had heavy wool snowsuits on,
Mm-hmm.
the only burn she got was like a first-degree burn on her arm.
Mm-hmm.
And then they got up, and they come walking down the road
Mm-hmm.
to where I was.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack was up there where Shirley was. In fact, I think Margie was up there too, because here she's laying on the road. Who knew but what she was dead, you know.
Uh-huh.
Uncle Clifton was just across the field in Grandpa's field,
Mm-hmm.
feeding cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And he happened to have a saddle horse with him.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw what had happened and jumped on that saddle horse
Mm-hmm.
and came across the field.
Mm-hmm.
But Aunt Fay and the baby and Mother and Dad are all down there at the house
Mm-hmm.
looking out the window at what's going on
Oh my
up
gosh.
there in the field. Well, Jimmy Rain jumped in the snowmobile to come back up there, because by that time, of course, Hannes had, he'd had to let go of the reins.
Mm-hmm.
But when the horses got down to the gate, the gate stopped them. But by then, everything was pretty much burned up.
Uh-huh.
But your mother and Lanny came down and met me,
Mm-hmm.
and all the skin was burned off my hand, and my mitten was burned, and it was hanging down here, and my fingernails were down here in the...
Oh my gosh, Aunt Mary.
But it was cold, and it was something, it didn't hurt because it was so cold. But we were just headed to the house.
Uh-huh.
And I can remember, and this is just one of these stupid things,
Uh-huh.
of Uncle Clifton riding up there past us on that horse. And I couldn't understand at the time why he didn't stop and ask me how I was or anything. Well, I know why he didn't. His little girl was laying up there on the road,
He was just headed to
He
her.
was just headed to her. I was
Looked
up
like
and
you were
walking.
fine. Yeah.
But then, was Mother? No, Jimmy Raines come up in the snowmobile,
Mm-hmm.
and he picked me and Shirley and Hannes up
Mm-hmm.
to take us back down to the house.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if Hannes was hurt
Mm-hmm.
or what,
Mm-hmm.
but all I remember, because Shirley had come to, and I didn't know then that she was in shock.
Uh-huh.
But Shirley always just screamed
Mm-hmm.
when she was hurt. And she was just screaming
Mm-hmm.
at the top of her voice.
Mm-hmm.
And they put us in that snow plane to take us to the house.
Mm-hmm.
And Hannes was swearing at her, actually swearing at her to shut up. And that upset me.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That really upset me, that he would swear at her and tell her to shut up.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, then we got to the house, and they had called the hospital,
Wow.
and they told them how to treat the burns,
Uh-huh.
and they got that done. And then Jimmy didn't finish his mail route that day. He just took Mother and the two of us into
Wow.
town to the hospital. And I can remember Mother sitting flat on her butt, Shirley in one arm, me in the other, Shirley still screaming at the top of her voice.
Oh my goodness. Uh-huh.
Took us to town to the hospital, and when we got in the hospital, Shirley was not burned nearly as bad as I was.
Uh-huh.
But they had to take care of her first because they had to put her out and stop her from screaming.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I can remember laying there watching them take care of her
Wow.
until they
Got to you.
got to me, and they had to put our hands on splints on a board. And we were in the hospital, I think, a full week.
Hmm.
And I can remember things that happened. You know, we'd get off the bed and crank up the bed, crank up each other's beds, but we were on a surgical diet. And I have always loved, ever since I was in the hospital, I have loved tomato juice and crackers because that was the first solid food that we got to have.
Wow.
And then around the corner from the hospital. And so we had to go over there and stay with them for so that we could go back to the hospital every day and have our dressings changed.
So this is the hospital in Jackson?
Yeah. The old log hospital that was where the Episcopal Church, next to the Episcopal Church, there right in the middle of town. And I think Shirley was probably over there staying with Aunt Lola for about another week, and she got to go home. But I couldn't go home. I stayed with Uncle Leland and Aunt Lola for a whole month.
Wow.
And every morning we'd have to go over, get my dressing changed, and Jessie Lundy was the nurse. And she would just tear that off where it was stuck. She'd just take it off, you know. Well, we finally got smart, Aunt Lola and I did, and we'd soak it in ST37. Just soak that bandage and get it really soaked before we'd go over there, and it'd all be loose. So that I was able to get through that.
Oh, Aunt Mary. And you were like 7 years, did you say?
Well, I hadn't turned 7 yet.
Oh my
This
gosh.
was in February, and so I was still 6.
Oh my gosh.
And in fact, I had my birthday
With your,
down there.
yeah.
Yeah, at Uncle Leland's. And
Did Mom ever come and visit you? Did the kids ever come down? It's too far and too much
well,
trouble.
and Mormon Row was snowed in,
Uh-huh.
but Grandpa and Uncle Lanny came to town, and they said I could go home for Lanny's birthday. So I had already had my birthday in town. His birthday is the 24th of March. So I went home for his birthday, and then I didn't go back. Mother just changed my bandages and everything. I mean, I went back to have it checked up, but I didn't go back and stay with
Yeah.
at Uncle Leland's.
Do you remember, how did Uncle Annie and Mom respond to you? Like, did they look at you and were they upset, or were they, do you remember at all how they
I think it was
responded?
just one of those things. It was just, we've got to get home. We got to get home to Mom, you know? And we just
Did what you had to do.
had a
But you
hold of
weren't
each other,
crying?
and not that
Were
I
you-
remember, because it didn't hurt.
You were in shock and in the frozenness.
Maybe some. It was just cold enough that and it burned deep enough. A deep burn like that doesn't hurt as bad as a superficial burn. And of course, Clara didn't go into the doctor because they were able to bandage her arm and take care of it without medical
Yeah.
help.
But everybody remembers it. I mean, it was a pretty pivotal.
Everybody remembers it, but you know, no one seems to remember it exactly the way I do. To me, it could have happened yesterday.
Yeah.
And Shirley doesn't remember anything about it, and I didn't know that until her dad was burned and was in the burn center down here at University Hospital, because I went up there and the family was all there, and I went down, they were all down in the cafeteria, and as minute I walked in, Shirley said, "Do you remember when we were burned?" I says,
And you're like, "Are you kidding?"
I remember like it happened yesterday. And she says, "I don't remember about it."
I feel like I remember about it. And
Well, what she remembers is what everybody else has told her,
Yeah,
you know. But
yeah.
and then it was when it dawned on me that she was in shock, is why she doesn't remember it,
Yeah.
and that's why she was screaming.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you know, mothers. Years later, when we worked at the hospital as nurse aides,
Mm-hmm.
I had to go down one night. They were so busy,
Uh-huh.
and I had to go back into work or something. And there had been a trailer up at Calder Bay or something caught on fire, and there was a woman in the hospital that was very badly burned. In fact, I think one of their children died in the fire.
Oh, dear.
And she was really badly burned. And the second I walked into that room, it just came flooding back to me, the smell
Uh-huh.
of burned flesh.
Uh-huh.
And Mother said she had the same experience
Uh-huh.
when she was working as a nurse aide. And she walked into a room where there was a burn victim, and she said it affected her the same way. It just came flooding back, that smell of burned flesh.
Eesh. Well, I mean, I remember growing up and my Aunt Mary and her burned hand and the drama of that. I didn't
Well.
necessarily know the details of the story and stuff,
Yeah.
but it was like my Aunt Mary's hand and the burning and the
Well, and
Moore
it was-
Monroe wagon and the
Oh,
drama
well,
of it, you know?
it was a big thing, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't have too many.
I'm just glad you survived it.
Well,
Jeez.
and you know, the ER nurse, well, I had a catastrophe the other day. Gary and I were changing the vent on the swamp cooler, and it came crashing down and cut my hand here, and I had to go to the emergency
Oh, my
room and have
goodness.
stitches. And the ER nurse saw my hand, and she wanted to know all about it, you know, and she was asking me how long it took me to
Get any
You know,
movement there.
get any movement. But you know, that was years. It
Uh-huh.
was years. But being a child, and you know, now they would have treated it entirely different.
Uh-huh.
But being a little kid, I wasn't about ready not to be able to use this hand. It's why
Uh-huh.
I'm so left-handed now, is because for a couple of years I had to write with my left hand.
Uh-huh.
But I'd just sit and I'd just push on these knuckles to get them to bend, you know, because I had to have it on a splint for a long time.
They probably wouldn't do that
No,
now.
I don't think they do that now. And of course, they do skin graft and everything.
Yeah, it
but
would look a lot better, and
And,
they would try to fix it up or something, probably.
yeah, it would be treated a lot different. But you know, it took me a lot of years to finally get so I could bend these knuckles.
Yeah, that's
like
pretty
this.
amazing, actually.
And it is, you know,
It's a
I mean,
self-therapy.
yeah, it's not beautiful, and there's things that I haven't been able to do with it and
Mm-hmm.
everything, but I've been able to use my hand.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not that big of a deal. It used to, for years, my knuckles would crack open, you know. But it was, you know, I probably could have been doing a lot of.
Do your grandkids ask you about your hand?
Oh
or-
yes,
Yeah.
At a certain age, it always
start
becomes
asking you about your
a
hand.
fascination, you
Uh-huh,
know.
uh-huh.
And in fact, I said the best telling of this story.
Uh-huh.
There's been several things people that have written about it.
Uh-huh.
One of the best tellings of this story, Taylor did.
Oh.
He came out and interviewed me when he was
Uh-huh.
going to school. He had to do an interview of
Uh-huh.
something, you know, and he came out and interviewed me. And I actually read his story, and I think Taylor did the best job
Wow.
of telling that story.
Huh.
But I've read a number of
Versions.
versions that they've, who is that gal that writes that little Teton
View.
View or whatever it is? She's interviewed Marjorie, and she's interviewed your mother and everything, and I read it and I think that's not
The story?
the way it was.
Uh-huh.
And Jack was asking me about it at somebody's funeral
Uh-huh.
a couple of years ago or something, and maybe it was at Lanny's, and he was asking me about it, and I said, you know, Jack, we all need to get together sometime and retell this story and get it right.
Well, there are as
Because
many versions as there are people who
Well,
experienced
this is the whole
it.
thing. Everybody tells it from from what they remember.
Yeah.
You know.
But I'm glad I finally got to hear it again. I know you've told it, but like, I got it now a
Well.
lot straighter than I have before. It's a good story. It's an awful story.
Well,
It's a
you know,
life-changing story.
It's when people say, "Well, how did you burn your hand?" I say, "Oh, it's one of those old pioneer
Uh-huh.
stories."
Stories.
It was a school bus fire, but it was our school bus was a covered wagon.
Yeah.
What?
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's pretty cool.